What happens when a fast food CEO goes undercover and witnesses an act of kindness that changes everything? David Reynolds had built his burger chain from the ground up. What started as a single location had grown into a small empire of 12 restaurants spread across 3 states. But lately, something felt off. Customer complaints were piling up, employee turnover was skyrocketing, and profits, while steady, weren't growing the way they should. He had a team of district managers reporting to him, but their answers always sounded the same: everything's fine. David didn't believe it, so he decided to see for himself. With the help of his assistant, he disguised himself as an average customer: gray hoodie, scruffy beard, old jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He even wore cheap reading glasses to change his appearance. No one at the store level had met him personally. To them, he was just another customer. His target. One of the locations in a rougher part of town. It had the highest number of customer complaints and the worst employee reviews. If something was wrong, this was the place to find out. David pulled into the parking lot and stepped inside. The place was clean but felt tense. Employees rushed around, avoiding eye contact. Customers waited longer than they should. A manager barked orders, but no one seemed happy to be there. Sliding into line, David observed everything. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile, took orders robotically. A kitchen worker messed up a burger, earning a glare from the shift manager. The atmosphere was cold, like everyone was just trying to survive their shift. Then something caught his eye. A homeless man, thin and weathered, shuffled inside. His clothes were tattered, his hands shaking slightly. People in line stepped away from him, wrinkling their noses. The man approached the counter hesitantly. Excuse me," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Do you have anything cheap?" The cashier, a young man with dark curls and a name tag that read Jake, glanced at the shift manager, who was busy checking his phone and ignoring the situation. David expected Jake to turn the homeless man away or call security. Instead, the kid reached into his own pocket, pulled out a $5 bill and slid it into the register. "Get whatever you want," Jake said, barely above a whisper. "It's on me." The homeless man's eyes widened. I can't, it's okay," Jake interrupted. "Just order something warm." The man hesitated, then whispered, "A cheeseburger, please." Jake nodded, punched in the order, and paid for it himself. David was stunned. The shift manager finally looked up, noticing what had happened. His face twisted in irritation. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Jake stiffened. He was hungry. "I paid for it." "I don't care," the manager snapped. "You don't give away food. If corporate finds out, we get written up. You want to write up?" Jake swallowed hard but didn't back down. "I paid for it, with my own money." The manager scoffed. "That's not the point, don't do it again." David felt his fists clenching. He wanted to step in, to call out the manager right then and there, but he couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. The homeless man took his food and whispered a quiet "thank you" before shuffling to a corner booth. David moved up in line, heart pounding. When it was his turn, Jake greeted him with the same tired smile he'd given everyone else. "What can I get for you, sir?" David ordered a basic meal, but his mind was racing. He had come here expecting to find problems, and but he had also found something else. A worker who actually cared, and a manager who didn't. This wasn't just about profits or operations. This was about the kind of company he had built. And right now, he didn't like what he was seeing. David took his tray and settled into a booth with a clear view of the counter. He barely touched his food. His mind was too busy piecing together what he had just witnessed. Jake had done something selfless, something human. And instead of being recognized for it, he had been reprimanded. David watched as Jake continued working, his movements precise but subdued. The kid was good at his job, but there was a heaviness to him, like he was walking on eggshells. Meanwhile, the shift manager, whose name tag read Troy, leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone again. Every now and then, he'd bark an order or roll his eyes at an employee's mistake, but he wasn't actually doing anything. David had seen enough bad managers to know the type. Troy was the kind who used authority as a shield, someone who had stopped caring a long time ago but was more than willing to throw his weight around. The dinner rush started picking up. More customers came in, the line stretched longer, and the tension in the air thickened. The kitchen was struggling to keep up, and orders were backing up on the screen. Jake was doing everything he could to keep things moving, but it was clear he was overwhelmed. Then, it happened. A woman at the counter, a mother with 2 small kids, checked her bag and frowned. "Excuse me, I'm missing a fry." Jake turned to the kitchen, but before he could speak, Troy groaned loudly and stomped over. "Are we seriously messing up orders now?" he snapped. The cook, a nervous-looking teenager, sputtered. I thought I put everything in, you thought wrong," Troy cut in, snatching up a fry container and shoving it into the bag. "Get it together." Then he turned to Jake. "And you stop wasting time, move faster." Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply passed the corrected order to the woman. David could feel the frustration rolling off of him. Minutes later, it got worse. A man in a business suit stepped up, his face already set in irritation. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for my food. This is ridiculous." Jake glanced at the screen and saw that the man's order was still being prepared. "I'm really sorry about the wait, sir. We're a little backed up, but I'll check on it right now." He turned toward the kitchen, but Troy beat him to it. "We're understaffed, buddy," Troy said flatly. "You want faster service, go somewhere else." David stiffened. The customer's face turned red. "Excuse me?" "I said we're doing the best we can," Troy replied, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're welcome to wait like everyone else." Jake looked horrified. "Sir, I can—" "No," the man cut in, shaking his head. "Forget it, I'll take a refund." Troy scoffed but didn't argue. He waved Jake toward the register. David watched as Jake processed the refund, his hands moving quickly, his expression unreadable. The businessman stormed out, but the damage was done. Other customers in line were grumbling now, throwing each other uneasy glances. David had seen enough. He stood, dumped his untouched food, and walked out, but he wasn't leaving. He was coming back. The next day, David arrived early, this time dressed as himself. No hoodie, no disguise, just the CEO of the company walking through the front doors unannounced. The morning crew was different, but by noon, the same faces from the previous night started filtering in. Jake arrived, looking tired but ready to work. Troy showed up 20 minutes later, barely acknowledging anyone as he clocked in. David waited. Then, at the peak of the lunch rush, he made his move. He stepped to the counter. Jake was at the register, focused on a customer's order, but when he glanced up and saw David, really saw him, his eyes widened. David didn't give him time to react. "I need to speak to the manager," he said, loud enough for employees and customers alike to hear. Troy, who had been leaning near the drink station, looked up, annoyed. "Yeah." "What do you?" He froze. Recognition dawned in his eyes. David didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The silence in the room was suffocating. Employees stopped moving. Customers glanced at each other, sensing something was happening but not fully understanding what. Troy swallowed hard. Mr. Reynolds, I didn't know you were coming, that's the point," David cut in. "I wanted to see this place in action, and I did." Troy paled. David turned to Jake. "And you are—" Jake hesitated. "Jake Carter, sir." David nodded. He turned back to Troy. "We need to talk, now." Troy scrambled to follow him to the back office. The moment the door closed, David turned on him. "What exactly do you think your job is here?" Troy blinked. "Sir, I manage the store. Really?" David's voice was sharp. "Because from what I saw, you don't lead." You don't support your team, you don't even respect the customers. Troy opened his mouth, but David wasn't finished. You humiliated an employee for showing kindness. You dismissed a paying customer like they were a nuisance. And worst of all, you've created an environment where your team is afraid to do anything but survive. Troy stammered, I was just trying to enforce the rules. What rule says you treat people like garbage? David snapped. Troy had no answer. David took a breath. His voice was lower now but no less firm. You're fired. Troy's mouth fell open. Wait, I've been here for 3 years. And in those 3 years, how many good employees have left because of you? Troy had nothing to say. David stepped aside. Clock out. You're done. Troy hesitated, glancing at the door like he was expecting someone to save him, but no one did. Finally, he swallowed hard, shoulders slumping. He turned, pushed the door open, and left without a word. David exhaled. Then he stepped back onto the floor. Every employee was watching him. Jake especially looked stunned. David met his gaze. Come with me. Jake hesitated but followed him to the office. David shut the door. You paid for that man's meal with your own money, he said. Jake straightened. Yes, sir. Why? Jake hesitated. Because he was hungry. David studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Starting today, you're getting a raise. And if you want it, I'm offering you a management training program. Jake blinked. What? You care about people, David said simply. This company needs more of that. Jake swallowed hard, emotions flickering across his face. I don't know what to say. Say yes. A pause. Then yes. Jake sat there, still trying to process what had just happened. A raise, a management program. The CEO of the company had just fired his boss right in front of everyone and then turned around and offered him an opportunity he never even thought possible. His heart was still racing. David leaned against the desk, arms crossed. I know this is a lot to take in, he said, but I meant what I said. I've seen enough bad managers to know the difference between someone who just wants power and someone who actually cares about people. You care. Jake swallowed hard. I thought it was the right thing to do. It was, Jake hesitated, but Troy wasn't wrong about the rules. I mean, technically, we're not supposed to give out food for free. You didn't, David interrupted. You paid for it. That's not against any rule I've ever written. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. David watched him for a moment, then pushed off the desk. Listen, I'm not asking you to decide right now. Think about it. But either way, the raise is happening. You've earned that much. Jake nodded, still stunned. Thank you, sir. David gave him a small smile, then opened the office door and motioned for him to follow. The moment they stepped back onto the floor, every employee turned to look at them. The tension from earlier had shifted. There was no fear now, just uncertainty. They had all seen Troy leave. They had all seen David take Jake into the office. And now they were waiting, trying to figure out what this meant for them. David didn't leave them in suspense. He stepped forward, voice firm but calm. I know today has been unexpected, he said. But I want to make one thing very clear. I'm not here to punish anyone who's trying their best. I came undercover to see what was really happening in my stores. And what I found was a team that's been working hard despite leadership that didn't respect them. That changes today. A few employees exchanged glances, some still wary, others looking oddly relieved. David turned to one of the kitchen workers, the nervous young man Troy had snapped at the night before. What's your name? The kid straightened, clearly caught off guard. Miguel, sir. David nodded. How long have you worked here, Miguel? 8 months. And in those 8 months, how often did Troy support you when things got stressful? Miguel hesitated, then glanced at Jake like he wasn't sure if he should answer. Jake gave him a slight nod. Miguel swallowed. Not really ever, sir. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. That's what I thought. He looked around at the rest of the team. That stops now. I need people who want to be here, and I need leadership that actually supports you. We're going to start making changes, better training, better scheduling, and more respect for the people who keep this place running. A murmur went through the employees. Some looked skeptical, but others seemed hopeful. David glanced at Jake. We'll talk more soon. For now, just keep doing what you've been doing. Jake nodded. David turned and walked toward the door. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He had a company to fix. By the time David returned to his corporate office, his assistant, Lisa, was already waiting for him. She took one look at his face and raised an eyebrow. I take it you found what you were looking for. Oh, I found plenty, David muttered, tossing his jacket over a chair. It's worse than I thought. Lisa set down her tablet. How bad? David ran a hand through his hair. Bad leadership, employees who are afraid to speak up, customers being mistreated, and the worst part. No one at corporate noticed because we've been relying on reports that only tell half the story. Lisa exhaled slowly. So what's the plan? First, we're overhauling management training. Starting now, no one gets promoted unless they actually understand how to lead people, not just how to boss them around. Lisa nodded, already taking notes. Second, David continued, I want an internal survey sent out to every employee, anonymous. I want to know what's really happening in these stores. No more sugar-coated reports. Got it. David leaned back in his chair. And third, I'm making unannounced visits a regular thing. No more relying on district managers to tell me everything's fine. I want to see it for myself. Lisa gave him an approving look. That might make some people nervous. Good, David said. If they're nervous, they're probably not doing their jobs right. Lisa smirked. Fair point, David exhaled. And one more thing, find out what's been going on with our turnover rates. I want to know why we're losing good employees. Lisa nodded. I'll pull the reports. David stared out the window of his office, his jaw tight. He had built this company from the ground up. It meant everything to him. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what really mattered, not just the numbers, not just the profits, but the people. That was going to change. Starting now, David wasted no time. The next morning, he was on a call with his top executives, his voice firm and unwavering. We need to talk about how we're running this company, he said. I spent 2 days inside one of our stores, and what I saw wasn't just bad leadership, it was a system that's failing our employees and our customers. A brief silence hung over the conference line. Then one of his senior operations managers, Greg, cleared his throat. David, if you had concerns, you could have asked us. We have reports. I don't want reports, Greg, David cut in. I've seen the reports. They don't tell me that a shift manager was openly disrespecting customers. They don't tell me that employees are afraid to speak up because they think corporate won't listen. They don't tell me that the only reason a homeless man got a meal was because one of our cashiers paid for it out of his own pocket. Another pause. Lisa, his assistant, broke the silence. We're already working on an internal survey to get direct feedback from employees, but David wants more than that. Yes, David said. Changes start now. First, leadership training is no longer optional, it's mandatory for every store manager and shift lead. If they don't pass, they don't stay in leadership. Greg hesitated. That's going to take time. Then we start immediately, David interrupted. Lisa will coordinate with HR to get it moving. Lisa nodded, already making notes. David continued. Second, every district manager is going to be held accountable for store conditions. No more brushing off complaints or giving me polished updates. I expect real oversight, and if they can't handle it, we'll find people who can. One of the other executives, a regional director named Marissa, finally spoke up. That's going to shake up a lot of people. It should, David said. If they're doing their jobs the right way, they have nothing to worry about. If they aren't, they shouldn't be here. Marissa exhaled. Understood. David wasn't done, and one more thing. We're launching an employee recognition program, real incentives, not just employee of the month plaques. Raises, bonuses, career growth opportunities. I want employees to know that if they work hard, they'll be rewarded. Greg hesitated again. That's going to increase costs. It's also going to reduce turnover, Lisa cut in. Which saves money in the long run. David nodded. Exactly. There were no more objections. David felt a familiar fire in his chest, the drive that had built this company from nothing. He had let himself get too distant, relying too much on numbers instead of people. That was over. The call ended, but David wasn't finished. His next stop was the store where it all started. When he walked through the doors, Jake was at the counter, taking orders with the same quiet efficiency as before. But this time, there was a difference. The tension from the previous days was gone. The employees moved with more ease, talking to each other instead of just working in silence. Jake spotted him and stiffened slightly, but David gave him a reassuring nod. Jake finished with a customer, then stepped toward him. Mr. Reynolds. David, he corrected. How's it going? Jake hesitated. Better, people are still adjusting, but it feels different? Good. David glanced around. I meant what I said about the leadership program. Have you thought about it? Jake took a deep breath. Yeah, I want to do it. David smiled. Then let's get started. Jake nodded, a spark of something new in his eyes, determination. David turned to the rest of the employees. Listen up. I know the last couple of days have been a shock. But I want you all to know something. I see you. I see how hard you work. And from now on, we're going to make sure that work is valued. A few of them exchanged glances, uncertain but hopeful. David met their eyes one by one. This company is changing, and it starts today. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Jake arrived at corporate headquarters 2 weeks later, dressed in a borrowed button-down shirt that was slightly too big for him. He felt out of place from the moment he stepped into the sleek, glass-paneled lobby. The receptionist greeted him warmly, but the polished atmosphere made him uneasy. He had spent the last few years flipping burgers and handling impatient customers. Now, he was about to sit in a boardroom with executives who made decisions that shaped the entire company. It didn't feel real. But David had made it clear he wasn't here as a favor. He was here because he had earned it. A woman approached him holding a tablet. Jake Carter, he straightened. Yes, ma'am. Follow me. She led him through a maze of hallways until they reached a large conference room. Inside, a handful of other employees sat at a long table, looking just as uncertain as he felt. Some wore store uniforms, others business attire, but they all had the same nervous energy. Jake took a seat near the end of the table. A few moments later, David walked in. The room fell silent. David didn't sit at the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out a chair near the middle and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. I know some of you are wondering why you're here, he said. Let me make it simple. You're here because you're the future of this company. A few employees exchanged glances, unsure whether to believe it. I started this business with one store, David continued. Back then, I worked the grill, took orders, and cleaned the floors. I knew every employee's name. But as we grew, I got further and further away from the day-to-day reality. That was a mistake, and I won't make it again. Jake listened intently. This program isn't about throwing you into a management position and hoping for the best, David said. It's about giving you the tools to succeed. Leadership isn't just about making schedules and tracking sales, it's about people. And I want leaders who understand that. He paused, scanning the room. You were all chosen because you've already shown that you care. Now, we're going to teach you how to turn that into real leadership. There was a quiet shift in the room. Some of the employees sat up straighter, their initial skepticism fading. David smiled slightly. "Let's get started." The next few weeks were a blur for Jake. He spent time in different stores, shadowing managers, sitting in on meetings, and learning the operational side of the business. It was overwhelming at first: profit margins, labor costs, supply chain logistics, things he had never thought about while working the register. But what stood out the most was how different the good managers were from the bad ones. The best leaders took time to check in with their teams, stepping in when things got overwhelming. They didn't just bark orders, they listened. They knew when to push employees to improve and when to give them support. And then there were the others. The ones who saw their employees as numbers. The ones who cut corners to make their own lives easier, even if it made the job harder for everyone else. Jake recognized them immediately. He had worked under people like Troy for years. Now he was learning how to be the opposite. One afternoon, David called him into his office. Jake stepped inside, feeling the weight of the moment. David gestured for him to sit. "How's it going?" Jake exhaled. "Honestly, it's a lot. I didn't realize how much goes into running a store." David nodded. "It's a lot of moving parts, but you're handling it." Jake hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready to manage a store yet." David studied him for a moment. "Good. That means you're thinking about it seriously." The worst leaders are the ones who assume they know everything. Jake nodded slowly. David leaned back in his chair. "I didn't expect you to be perfect overnight. Leadership takes time. But I've seen enough to know you have what it takes." Jake swallowed hard. David continued. "I want to start you as an assistant manager. You'll have support and you'll keep learning. If you prove yourself, we'll talk about moving you up from there." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. A year ago, he had been just another employee, taking orders and trying to get through each shift. Now he was being offered a real chance to move up. He looked David in the eyes. "I won't let you down," David smiled. "I know." Jake's first week as an assistant manager was a trial by fire. The store he was assigned to was understaffed and the team was exhausted. The previous assistant manager had quit suddenly, leaving the store manager scrambling to fill the gap. Jake stepped in, doing whatever was needed. He ran the register, worked the grill, and even stayed late to help clean. He didn't just give orders, he worked alongside his team. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. Employees who had been disengaged started listening. They saw that Jake wasn't just another manager who would stand around and criticize, he was in the trenches with them. One evening, after a particularly rough shift, one of the cooks, a woman in her 40s named Maria, pulled him aside. "You're different," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" Maria smiled. "Most managers, they come in, tell us what we're doing wrong, and disappear into the office. You actually help." Jake shrugged. "I know what it's like to be in your shoes," Maria nodded. "It shows." Jake felt a small sense of pride. He wasn't just filling a position, he was making a difference. A month later, David made another unannounced visit. Jake was in the middle of handling a lunch rush when he spotted him near the counter, watching. This time, there was no tension in the air. Employees moved quickly but efficiently. Customers were being served with real smiles, not forced ones. The team worked together, covering for each other when needed. Jake met David's gaze. David gave him a nod, just a slight one, but it said everything. Jake had earned his place, and this was just the beginning.